Well, good morning, everyone. KPMG is proud to partner with this event, and it's my pleasure to introduce the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Homelessness, the Honourable Clare O'Neil. Minister O'Neil has had a distinguished parliamentary career. She is a practical, thoughtful leader on so many issues, a sharp and fierce intellect, a champion of very, very disadvantaged people, and a person of deep understanding of complex issues. Already she's making a significant impact on housing policy in Australia. Minister, we are really looking forward to hearing from you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming Minister Clare O'Neil.
Well, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. And I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. I'm so sorry, I'm just getting a lot of feedback there. So hopefully we can work that through. That sounds good. Thank you. That's so much better. Okay, so I want to acknowledge the traditional owners. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any First Nations people who are here with us today. This is obviously a hugely important forum gathering together leaders from right across Western Sydney. And I want to particularly acknowledge Chris Brown and Jennifer Westacott, who are two Australians who have decided to devote their life to the future of their country. And we're so very lucky that they have chosen their loved Western Sydney to be chief advocates for. So it's wonderful to be with you this morning. Jennifer's mentioned, I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be there with you in person. You're experiencing some of the real-time vagaries of democracy. It's not always pretty, but we do tend to get the job done, which we've done this morning. So I really do apologise that I'm not there in person. I got involved in politics as a really young person, and I did that because I care passionately and deeply about fairness for Australians. I found myself in the housing and homelessness portfolio about 4 months ago, and I could not feel a stronger sense of mission about the work that we are all doing together on housing. If you care about equality and opportunity in Australia today, if you care about productivity and our nation's economic growth, there is no more important issue to be involved with than in housing. I absolutely love working with this sector. This problem is being tackled by some of the most can-do people in Australia, and there's nothing I love more than rolling up my sleeves, getting involved and taking action on big, important national problems. Housing is, without question, a life-defining issue for millions of our citizens. And every day across Western Sydney, we're seeing more Australians feel in situations of real serious housing difficulty. We've got young people who are competing with each other for rental properties, spending their entire days on a Saturday lining up in groups of 50 or 60 people. We've got families with children who are being forced to shift their kids from school to school because they cannot find that foothold in the market. And homelessness, of course, everywhere around the country is on the rise. So those are really immediate and urgent problems that I know that you're really concerned about in your day-to-day work. But the thing I'm worried about most of all is this one statistic. When we go back to 1980, when we look at the rates of home ownership for low-income young people, they sat at about 60% back in those days. And when we look at that equivalent home ownership rate for low-income young people today, the rate of home ownership is somewhere around 20%. This is an absolutely dramatic change to see in our country over just one generation. And it is something that I feel really urgently motivated about, because housing is, of course, about those fundamental issues of housing security and making sure that people are living a good life day to day. What we're seeing, though, is that this is having huge impacts on what it means to live in our country and what it means to be Australian. It means that the experience of being low income a generation ago was fundamentally different and is profoundly more precarious than life was a generation ago. And that is something we absolutely must work together to change. So big picture, unsurprisingly, we have a Commonwealth government in Canberra with an enormously bold and ambitious agenda for housing. And I say unsurprisingly because, as we know, our country is led today by a Prime Minister who was raised by a single mum, lived in public housing for almost all of his childhood, and now he's the Prime Minister of our country. This is a person whose entire life trajectory was changed by housing, and so he's urgently seized of the need for us to really act on this problem. Big picture, what we are trying to do is first and foremost tackle the supply problem. For whatever complexities there are around the description of housing difficulties in Australia today, they all come back to one quite simple thing, and that is that we have not been building enough homes in our country for more than 30 years. So we are working with the states to build, and trying to build 1.2 million homes in Australia over the coming 5 years. We're also working to try to get a better deal for renters so they have more safety and security. And of course, we want to see more Australians get into home ownership. Housing has had a massive week this week in Canberra. In fact, I am not aware of a week where we've had such a significant step forward on housing policy in our country, certainly in recent years. We've had two very big pieces of Labor's agenda finally work their way through the Parliament, and I just want to quickly explain what it is that those new laws will do. The first is a law called Help to Buy. This is a bill that will create a shared equity scheme that will help 40,000 childcare workers, nurses, early career teachers, and other people on ordinary incomes be able to get into their own home for the first time. It's a really enormously important thing, and I think it's going to be fantastic for our country. The other bill is a bill called Build to Rent, and this is a bill that will generate 80,000 new homes for rent over the next 10 years in our country. This is the most significant effort made by a federal government to address the rental deficit for a long, long time, and it actually just passed the Parliament an hour ago. So build to rent, I know many of you in the audience will be really familiar with this model. Build to rent is a very, very common form of property development in markets around the world. And the bill that we have passed the Parliament will help stimulate that sector here in Australia. But it also mandates that 10% of the new rental properties that are built must be affordable properties. So this is really fantastic. As you know, our government is doing a huge amount of work trying to get social and affordable housing built in our country. This is a way of us, making sure that in perpetuity we are going to see this sector grow and build, and forever 10% of apartments and dwellings which are created by this type of investment structure will be affordable housing. It's a fantastic way for us to just push that normal requirement for affordability for the mix of housing that we want to see out into the general residential sector. So after a week in Parliament, I can say that we've made a really big step in the right direction on housing, and I think it's a really important part of our government's first term agenda. These two bills are important, but they're only parts of what is a really bold and ambitious housing agenda that our government is executing on at the moment. $32 billion, which we are spending on building more homes, helping renters get a fair deal, and making sure that we get more Australians into home ownership. Now, when we look around Western Sydney, we can see the positive legacies of lots of former federal governments, which have worked closely with your state government in New South Wales to deliver homes that Western Sydney needs. We've seen that happen before, of course, under the leadership of Prime Ministers like Ben Chifley and Gough Whitlam, and it's happening again now. So in our first term, we have done something very important, which I don't think has quite got the coverage that it deserves. We have done these important things around housing policy, and we've done some of the technical things that I've just talked to you about here today. But if I just step back, the biggest thing that we have actually done is we have rebuilt the Commonwealth's role in housing policy in our country. I'm not going to spend my speech, talking politics today, but it is just a fact of the matter that the previous government had a fundamentally different view about the Commonwealth's engagement in housing policy. And when they were elected in 2013, Tony Abbott had a very strong values proposition to withdraw the Commonwealth from housing policy. We have laid some very different foundations, used the leadership of the Commonwealth to make sure that we can coordinate, lead, and help in funding the big changes to housing policy that will get the issues addressed that I've talked about today. Our investments in building new social and affordable housing have led to new homes in Western Sydney. So we've seen that in Schofields, in Liverpool, in Bonnyrigg, Westmead, Riverwood, Carlingford, and other parts of Western Sydney. We've also got some important Housing Australia Future Fund announcements that will be made fairly soon. So for those of you that are not really deep in housing policy, the Housing Australia Future Fund is one of our government's landmark initiatives on housing. It is a $10 billion fund that we have given to Housing Australia, and Housing Australia is now leveraging investment from across the economy to make sure that we can bring on 30,000 social and affordable homes over the coming period of time. So we've just made the first announcements. It's 13,700 homes around the country, just in round one of the Housing Australia Future Fund. And many of those are located actually right there in Western Sydney. Home ownership is really important to our government. I've talked about the Help to Buy scheme, which is the kind of most interventionist aspect of our home ownership approach. But when we came to government, we expanded the home guarantee scheme. So this is a scheme that allows, predominantly young people to get into the market without having to purchase lender's mortgage insurance. We've helped 130,000 people get into home ownership through the expanded home guarantee scheme since we've been in government, and more than 10% of those people are in Western Sydney. One other element I want to make you aware of is, of course, the extremely expansive infrastructure program of the government. One of the important roles that the Commonwealth can play here is making sure that we are supporting the construction of new builds by addressing all of those underlying things that are needed: water, sewerage, roads, all of those kind of boring but important aspects that make housing developments possible. We've got a 10-year, $120 billion infrastructure pipeline that contains over $17 billion in road and rail projects and critical infrastructure in Western Sydney. So this is things like Elizabeth Drive and Cambridge Avenue, Richmond's roads, and of course the new international airport, which we're very excited about. These investments are really important. They don't always make the front page, but this is the kind of gritty work that the Commonwealth needs to get involved in to make sure that we build more homes and connect Western Sydney's growing population to the jobs of the future. I wanted to touch on construction productivity because I've been in my role now for 4 months. We've had a legislative agenda we've had to deal with. We've had some policy issues that needed to be bedded down. Construction productivity is something that I'm worried about. And as all of you know who are involved in property, who are in the room there, this is a really important issue for housing, for us addressing our housing needs. We've got a construction productivity problem in our country, and all the records tell us that effectively we haven't adjusted the way that we've been building homes really for about 30 years or so, and for us to get the big step change in construction numbers that we're going to need to see, that is going to have to change. So we've laid some important parts of the puzzle out for this already. You might have seen recently that the Treasurer announced a $900 million investment, which is trying to encourage state governments to do some of the really critical work that they can do to unlock construction productivity. But part of the answer here is for us to work together to find innovative ways, both for us to build better, but also just remove those delays and additional costs which are being imposed by governments. One of the things that really gives me a lot of confidence about the housing issues that we're confronting today is that our country has actually dealt with issues like this in the past and done so really successfully. And one of the core things that has been important to us addressing housing needs in the past has been a strong collaboration between the Commonwealth and state governments. The Prime Minister has been instrumental in making sure that the Commonwealth builds national leadership. You would have seen that our government has built a national housing accord, which is effectively an agreement between the Prime Minister and the premiers and leaders around the country to make sure that we can get coordinated action on housing. And one of the really important things that I've really observed since I've been in this role is that real push and work and the fire that's being driven by the Commonwealth is starting to really pay off. We've got state governments doing hugely difficult reform at a state level, and they're doing that because, our citizens are telling us that it's time to take really strong action on this stuff. So I really want to credit the work that Premier Minns is doing in New South Wales. He's a critical national voice for us on housing. And, just wading into some of the real difficulties about planning reform is one of the most powerful things that anyone in our country can do. And we're seeing that also too in my home state of Victoria, where our Premier Jacinta Allen has gotten really, really engaged in trying to deal with those same issues. So I have a lot of confidence about what we're doing here on housing as a country. And one of the things that I see very clearly when I look around the nation is we have, for the first time in certainly in my lifetime, we've got a Commonwealth government, critical state governments around the country and local governments actually saying we've got a massive national problem here and we need to change the way housing works in our country, not just in piecemeal ways and not just for the short term, but actually rebuild our housing system in our country. It is not happening perhaps as quickly as many people would like, and I'm one of them. Jennifer sort of told you off the top there, I'm all for urgent action every single day. But I do think we're actually making real inroads here, and we had 2 big wins in the Parliament this week. That's a great step forward. So I really want to thank all of you for the incredible work that you're doing to help with this national mission to address our housing crisis. And Chris, I'm really looking forward to a bit of questions and discussion, and love to hear from the audience about what they think about what's going on up here in Canberra.
Thank you, Minister. Good morning. Thank you to all you hardy souls who love a good bit of infrastructure and housing policy with your cornflakes, getting up early. Thank you, Minister, for surviving the vagaries of democracy. And I recognise if the bells start ringing, then panel, you're on early. So we understand it's fun. It's the last day of Parliament in Canberra for the year, maybe for the term, we don't know, but certainly for the year. So everything's happening and it's been a big housing week. Look, for me personally, great pride to talk to Clare, and as Jennifer said, she's the action woman who's come in impatient and keen to get into it. I had the great pleasure of both Chris Minns last night and Clare O'Neill this morning, together with people you might know, like the Treasurer Jim Chalmers and Ed Hughes, the Industry Minister, 10 years ago. These guys were identified as future Labor leaders in a program I ran, which shows pretty well. I think the investment of these people have sort of emerged from the pack, but all of them driven by this sort of public policy piece. Clare, to that end, can I go to the politics of housing first? I don't mean the partisan politics, and you're a politician in an election, you're allowed to be as partisan as you like, that's fine. But I've sit here tonight, I can see your kids behind you. We're some of the people in Australia who our kids will probably be housed because the bank of mum and dad can help. I fear in a place like Western Sydney or Western Melbourne and suburban parts across Australia that we're about to have the greatest social divide the nation's ever known. Kids whose parents can help them buy a house and kids whose parents can't help them buy a house or even long-term help them rent. I've got a 29-year-old and a 24-year-old who just moved back in, who couldn't afford their home. I've got an 8-year-old who never know much about it. How do 3 levels of government, and particularly the private sector as well, how do we have some confidence going forward that we don't split this nation with those with a home and those without a home? Because it's something we've never had. On the fringes, absolutely, but I'm talking to the mainstream bulk of Australia. There'll be those with a home, those without a home, on where we're going. Is there, of all the crisis, all the action, all the urgency, is there extra stuff we can still do to avoid what will be a terrible social outcome?
Yeah, such an important question, Chris. Couldn't agree more. When you look at the stats, the Bank of Mum and Dad is playing an absolutely formative role in the housing market today. It's actually quite terrifying. A massive share of first homeowners now are using the Bank of Mum and Dad and are using it, to the tune of in the high tens of thousands of dollars to put down their deposit. Now, of course, I don't have any objection to people accumulating wealth in their family. That's a, very, very fantastic Australian aspiration that helps drive our nation forward. The people that I'm worried about, of course, though, are those without the Bank of Mum and Dad. And we're going to see, a pretty transformational change in our country as the wealth of the baby boomers is passed down to that next generation, and many people will be without, and those are the housing, the people about whose housing I'm most concerned. So what do we do about this? The most important thing for us to understand from a public policy point of view is that we've got to fix the supply side problems. if we tackle this only through demand levers, and what I mean by that is constantly finding ways to help people borrow more, to access super, all these sorts of things, what we will continue to see is more and more price inflation and more inability of those young people without property wealth in their family to get anywhere in this market. We have to address the supply side. And if there's one thing that I feel really good about with the current debate, the experts and I think most of the people who are there in this room are absolutely there. Gone are the days where in politics you could get away with just bringing to an election, a couple of things to help people borrow more or access super. Those sorts of things just aren't given any credibility anymore, thank God. What we actually need to do is roll up our sleeves and do that gritty, hard work of building more homes. And not just that, but reshaping construction so that we don't just build more homes in year 1, year 2, year 3, but we actually turn construction on, we turn that tap on higher, into the indefinite future, because we're otherwise just going to continue to see this problem. So supply.
A couple of quick ones for me. We've got a panel following with your very own Scott Langford and Homes User Osboss and developers and everybody. So we'll get the audience feedback there and we'll come back to you on that, conscious of your time before the bells ring. Couple of other ideological issues that drive the dialogue in our housing policy and are framing part of our federal election strategy you're going to report you'll see tomorrow or this week is consolidation. We've just come back from London for the second time, and the screaming message from a place like East London that's a wonderful model for Australia to, similar jurisdictions, culture, politics, etc., is scale, and then more scale. We cannot take a crisis on piecemeal of a couple of apartments out the back of a granny flat is not going to solve our problem. For that scale, we're also big fans of scale and capacity, whether it's rebuilt, that Beck's doing, rebuilt, state housing agencies, and importantly, big professional dynamic CHPs to partner with you. So where do you see the role for your funding stream to encourage that scale and that professionalism? And where do you see the role for the private sector to take your 10 billion half and make it a 50 billion half? Our best hope.
Very subtle advocacy there, Chris. Thank you so much. We're only multiplying it by 5. That's great. So a couple of things to say. Totally agree with you. I mean, this is basic economics, that if we can find faster ways to do things in a more uniform manner, then we're going to build quickly and efficiently. One thing that we have a real role in here is, as you point out, the community housing sector. The community housing sector are professionalising at a rate of knots. They are incredible people who are often taking property skills that they've learned in the private sector and really harnessing them for public good. The Housing Australia Future Fund is a vehicle for us to assist in that process of trying to refine and make a little bit more uniform some of the work that we're doing. What I'm really saying there is, round 1 of the Housing Australia Future Fund was a very open book. It was very much about trying to stimulate what those models of home building are going to look like that are going to work for the future. As we move forward with HAF, we can become much more specific and refined and be clearer about what we think the right models are. And I think that will help the community housing sector get into, a much more high efficiency, high output frame of mind, which will be fantastic.
Okay. Bit of politics for you. We want your HAF and we kind of want Peter Dutton's water bill. We want them both. Where are we going to have to choose? I know he's saying his water fund for the states and the corollary of a Whitlam government 50 years ago facing exactly the same issue and a federal government stepping in to help with water to allow the development of all the homes we need. So he's offering lots of money for state governments or local to do water. You've got the HAF. We want to be a 50-year certain policy and not affected by politics. How do we sort of get both? Because we kind of need both.
Well, Chris, the infrastructure announcement that was made recently by the Liberals, that's just overlaying on a program that Labor already delivers. So Catherine King, through her work, has an infrastructure fund that's just granted $1.5 billion out for infrastructure. So they say invitation's the sincerest form of flattery, which I'm going to take for that one. To be totally direct and honest with you, I don't think there's going to be any question about who is the right party to take this housing agenda forward. I just don't think there's going to be any question. We've got an absolutely holistic plan here $32 billion. We've laid those foundations for the Commonwealth to really lead here. And that's one of the main things that's been lacking really over the last 30 years. Just one thing to just make you aware of, for a long time, since the post-war period, effectively the Commonwealth has been retreating back out of housing or just playing a role at that real welfare end of the sector. Our government is the first government in so many decades to actually come in and say, we are going to assist with the provision of housing for ordinary Australians. And you really have to go back to the post-war period to see that. So building more homes, helping renters get a fair deal, getting more Australians into home ownership. We've got critical pieces of the puzzle here that will be unwound if the Liberals are elected. So there's a heap at risk here. Let me leave you with one thing. And we've got a $32 billion housing agenda, and Peter Dutton said that he's going to cut $19 billion of that. So I don't want to end on a negative note. I want you to see we've got a visionary, bold government in Canberra on housing, and we need to be able to continue that work into a second term.
Well, let me end on a very positive note. To inform you as the Federal Minister for Housing that last night Mason and Main in the beautiful little hamlet of Merrylands where my mother grew up won the Housing of the Year project for Western Sydney. Here that Aris Labutus from Coronation's on the panel to follow. So on that point, I just want to touch on your issue around supply side. We have a situation we're being told across the market that you cannot properly build an apartment block west of Olympic Park where we sit today. You're a brainiac, ex-McKinsey, one of the youngest mayors in the country, rapid rise through politics. Are you going to help us find a way to solve that supply side crisis? Because a lot of smart people keep saying it's real tough. And I'm no property engineer, but if we can't literally build an apartment building to the west profitably, God knows how we're going to do it. So I don't think you're going to reinstitute the Public Works Department of Australia to build every home.
I think anyone who thinks that government's going to build homes more cheaply and faster than the private sector has never worked in a government. So just leave that with you. Yeah, absolutely, Chris. This is a huge issue. And we came into government in the middle of really the worst housing crisis our country's experienced in probably 50 years. And at the same time, intense problems in the construction sector, massive increases in construction costs that are being felt all over the world. We've got, interest rates that are historically high, at least looking at recent history. So there's lots of barriers and problems facing construction at the moment that I'm really, really aware of. So we've got a lot of things that we're working on. Skills is a huge barrier, and we've done a massive amount of work getting more construction skills out here on the ground. We've got to do some more work on that productivity piece that I'm really, really passionate about. But I just share with you last night, one of the big pieces that went through the Parliament was a halving of the tax rate for investment in build-to-rent properties for foreign investors. There's no simple answer to your question. What it means is that the Commonwealth, state and local government all have to do 20 to 30 things differently to remove barriers, regulations and costs from construction, and we will start to see those numbers pick up. But I know it's tough out there at the moment, and we're doing everything we can to try to get things moving.
Minister, I want to thank you. I want to also thank Jennifer Westacott. She's gone back to, to save Big Four, going back to KPMG, but as the Chancellor of our beloved Western Sydney University as well. To you, thank you for enduring this morning. The technology actually worked, so I'm glad we fixed the feedback. Almost never have I been ever at a conference where a live link's ever worked, but I'm delighted it has, and the bells haven't even rung. But I might invite Jennifer back up to propose a vote of thanks, and can I throw in my tuppence worth? Well done on the BTR legislation. We've all been sweating on it for a long time. I don't think most Australians know what BTR is, but it's the hottest new acronym in the country. So thank you very much for your time.